The Free State of Jones. Legend holds that this sparsely populated region of Mississippi actually seceded from the Confederacy during the Civil War. But is this historical fact or local myth? And the leader of the Free State, Newt Knight, was he a coward, a deserter, a traitor to the South who became a murdering bandit? Or was he a man of courage fighting for justice against an oppressive government? What really happened more than a century ago, deep in the piney woods of Mississippi?
Cotton in 1860 was the nation's most valuable export item, and Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. So it was a wealthy state. But Jones County did not produce that much cotton. It had the smallest slave population of any county in Mississippi.
They don't really own a lot of slaves here because that's not what these people were about for the most part. Most of them were small farmers with no slaves. Probably 80% of them, the farmers in Jones County, didn't own one single slave.
These are really, I call them the kind of yeoman farmer class, those who are trying to ascend up the economic ladder. They were not going to have a huge cotton plantation.
The poor and working class farm families of Jones County have little interest in growing cotton. But the cotton plantation owners and business leaders of Mississippi do. Any threat to their slave-based economy will call for a decisive response.
Mississippi fire-eater politicians hated Abraham Lincoln, so when he's elected president in the fall of 1860, the Mississippi governor, John Pettus, called for a secession convention in Jackson.
Jones County elected a pro-union, anti-secession delegate for the convention. But during the convention, the delegate betrayed his constituents, voting with the majority to secede from the Union.
They supposedly burned him in effigy in Ellisville because the people weren't too happy about the fact that he votes for it, and in return, he got a job in the Confederate government as provost marshal over Jones County, which was handy because he didn't have to go to the front.
Once Mississippi seceded, it had to begin mobilizing for war. And initially, there was a great outpouring of enthusiasm. More men volunteered to serve than the state needed. Many men from Jones County did go off and they fought in the Confederate military. But in the course of the war, Jones County became most famous for Newt Knight and his company of Confederate deserters who went on to fight a guerrilla war against Confederate officials.
Newt Knight apparently joined willingly. He is listed as a volunteer and as a private. And he served very well during, I think, the first year, and then he was released from service by one of the generals. And there's no record of exactly why. It may have been because his father died.
Newt Knight's release doesn't last long. As casualties mount, the Confederate Congress passes a Conscription Act in 1862, drafting thousands of Southern men between the ages of 18 and 35 for military service.
The draft was incredibly unpopular. To many Southerners, especially people who accepted the states' rights ideology or the states' rights doctrine, it seemed as if they had replaced one tyrannical national government with another.
A lot of the people in the community were sort of like, we're not sure who the enemy is. They told us that it was the North, that it was the Yankees, but the Confederates, conscript officers are coming and getting our sons. Some of them are not even of age. Houses were burned, barns were burned. It was a vicious conscription act.
Then next thing you know, they were conscripting us. They just come around with a squad of soldiers and took them.
Newt only agreed to go in as a medic, and everyone agreed that he went in as a medic. Of course, when you get at the front lines and they need another man on the, with a rifle, then you become a frontline soldier.
Newt Knight is promoted to sergeant and takes part in the bloody Battle of Corinth. The Confederates are defeated, and even veteran soldiers are shocked by the carnage they've witnessed.
After Corinth fell, many men in Knight's company simply concluded that the war couldn't be won, or that the cost of continuing the war was too great to bear, and they went back to Jones County.
Newt Knight and others are further disillusioned when the Confederate Congress passes the 20 Slave Law, exempting anyone who owns 20 slaves from military service.
Jasper Collins was a close friend of mine. This law, he says to me, makes it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. I'm through. He threw down his gun and started home. Well, I felt the same way about it, so I started back home. I felt like if they had a right to conscript me when I didn't want to fight the Union, I had a right to quit when I got ready.
For poor people, people who didn't own 20 slaves, it seemed as if they were fighting to protect somebody else's property, that they were being asked to bear a disproportionate burden.
Guys like Newt felt like from the beginning that they were sort of being railroaded into this war. And a lot of these guys started to realize a couple of things. Everyone with any political pull, any local office, or anybody that the president said, make exempt, they were exempt from the fighting. So that left the poor white yeoman farmers to be the soldiers that are going to fight and die. And they start to realize, in fact, Newt Knight began to realize, that they were slaves. We're not picking the cotton, but we're the ones that are going to go die so they can keep the slaves picking the cotton. And we really don't want to do that. And so a lot of them began to desert. Thousands of them deserted.
Nobody, basically for the first year of when desertion started, objected to it much. It was as the war went on, efforts to capture deserters and punish them became a real goal of the Confederacy because they were just losing so many.
In early 1863, Newt Knight is again seized by Confederate forces.
We know that he was tortured, which probably means, 39 lashes, like they would give a slave. His comrades said he was treated very cruelly. He was put in chains, and he was under arrest during the Vicksburg campaign.
But Newt Knight deserts again, setting out for Jones County. He will never be rearrested. A few weeks later, the strategic port city of Vicksburg falls. The tide of the war has clearly turned. Desertion rates increase. All across the South, Confederate military authorities confiscate household goods, livestock, and produce. Thousands of Confederate soldiers return home and find their families literally starving. Facing such hardship, Serena Knight, Newt's wife, flees with her children to her relatives in Georgia. Newt Knight returns to find an empty home.
I believe that Newt Knight came to hate the Confederacy, and the Confederacy really hated deserters like Newt Knight. To the Confederacy, he was a traitor, but he left them to take care of his family. The Confederates were robbing our people, his wife. They were robbing other families of everything they had, cloth, food, and leaving children behind with nothing to eat. I can't see how you can call that being a traitor. He went home to take care of the families that they have robbed.
We saw we had to fight, so we organized this company, and the boys elected me captain.
When we look at the Civil War and we look at the Knight Band there, it's interesting to trace the evolution of their opposition to the Confederacy. Many men would desert and then just to get a rest, go back and plant crops, make sure their families were okay, and then they'd go on back. But these men who joined the Knight Band, part of the reason why they formed the band was because they were determined they were not going to go back into the Confederacy. That was it. In fact, they were going to fight against the Confederacy.
Knight's company. Many different interpretations about what motivated Knight's men to fight. Some have argued that Knight was simply a desperado, an opportunist. He was going to take advantage of wartime chaos to settle old scores, to enrich himself and his followers. Others have argued that he was a kind of Robin Hood figure, that Knight was a champion of poor yeoman farmers who were struggling to resist the power of Mississippi's wealthy slaveholders. Still others have argued that he was a dyed-in-the-wool Unionist who had opposed secession from the beginning, and he was fighting a campaign to free Jones County from Confederate rule.
He, along with Jasper Collins, formed this gang of at least 100 men, and that's what they would do. They would hide out, and then they would attack supply trains and take their food and whatever they could get back to the people in the communities, because they were really destitute.
They attacked warehouses where Confederate officials were storing food. They attacked tax collectors. They attacked people who were sent into Jones County to round up deserters. On at least 2 different occasions, the Confederate military sent men into Jones County in an attempt to crush Knight and his company.
At a certain point, when the desertion levels had gotten pretty high in Jones County, a man named Amos McLemore, who was a major with the Confederate Army, was sent in to gather up deserters, arrest them. And he was taking dinner at the home of Amos Deason in what's now known as the Deason House. And on that night, Newt Knight and 2 of his companions, this has never been proven, but is generally accepted even by Newt Knight's own son, they murdered Amos McLemore rather than risk being hauled in as deserters.
The Newt Knight has always been blamed for the murder of McLemore, but he was never charged with a crime. They don't know who shot McLemore, and that's why they didn't charge Newt Knight with a crime.
In the spring of 1864, Confederate Colonel Robert Lowry leads 2 regiments of infantry and 200 cavalrymen into Jones County to pursue and execute members of the Knight Company.
He was rough beyond reason. He hanged some of my company he had no right to hang.
2 teenage boys from Knight's company are hanged. Today, a marker in Jones County recognizes them for being unjustly killed for their honest convictions. Despite never finding Newt Knight and never capturing any of his inner circle, Lowry proclaims his expedition a success and withdraws his men from Jones County, never to return.
The Confederates felt justified in their rebellion against the United States, but they were not about to tolerate a rebellion within the Confederacy. They hated the very idea of Newt Knight in the Free State of Jones. General Leonidas Polk wrote President Jefferson Davis explaining to him that these Southern Yankees had taken over this part of the state because the Knight Company had raised the United States flag over the courthouse in Ellisville. They've overturned the Confederate government there. The Confederate officials were on the run, the tax collectors were on the run, the sheriff was gone. In effect, they had seceded from the Confederacy because it was an independent government now.
I don't see a stand taken against all authority. I see a choice made here that the Confederacy is not the legitimate government. It is destroying us, destroying our lives, and they do support the U.S. government, and they said so. And I think it's important historically to recognize that.
Unlike other renegade bands of deserters, Knight and his men accept and support runaway slaves. One of these was Rachel, a former slave of Newt's grandfather.
She became Newt Knight's ally during the war, and then later, of course, entered into a relationship with him, has several children by Newt Knight. And that's where the 2 stories, the one story of an insurrection and the other story of a mixed-race community, I mean, that's where they converge.
There was no color line for Newt, especially after the war. We see that because he's wide open with this relationship and poses for pictures proudly. You can see him in their Sunday finest with one of his grandsons, in fact. And it's just amazing to see that at a time when that wasn't popular in Mississippi at all, and he does it anyway. When did the Civil War end? Some would say it's still not over, because there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of healing that needs to come. What we do know is it doesn't end in 1865 like it says in the books, because there's a shooting war that begins as soon as the war between the North and the South ends. And that was a war of violence against the Unionists, white Unionists, and against African Americans.
In order to recreate the life they enjoyed, the all-white Mississippi legislature passes into law the so-called Black Codes, denying the civil rights of newly freed slaves.
What the Black Codes essentially do is it sets up a state for Black people and white Southerners that most closely resembles slavery. So, for instance, Black unemployment is criminalized because you are considered a vagrant. Black and white people cannot marry. I mean, so there are a number of slave codes that now become Black codes, and Mississippi is the first state to enact it in November 1865.
With Mississippi and other former Confederate states unwilling to respect African Americans as full citizens, the period of radical Reconstruction begins. Union troops continue to occupy southern states to maintain order. High-ranking Union officers are appointed as military governors in each state. Mississippi's governor was Adelbert Ames.
He bought into the idea of equality and social justice in Mississippi, and he fought for that, and he used people like Newt, native white Mississippians who were on the ground in different parts of the state to try to help him do that.
You really have an effort going on there to restructure Southern society, to create, to grant citizenship rights, not just freedom, but citizenship rights to former slaves. And Newt Knight appears to be a part of that. He was immediately given political appointment. He was a relief commissioner in 1865, and as relief commissioner, he had several orders coming to him from Northern Union officers who were stationed in Mississippi.
They're given orders to him to do things like rescue slave children from families who are not admitting that slavery is over, to help destitute women, to help poor people in general, distribute grain, bacon, food to people that were starving. After the war, the landscape was pretty barren because the farms were in such bad shape.
But in the mid-1870s, the Reconstruction period comes to an end, and so do the political and social reforms that Reconstruction brought. Soon, many of Mississippi's pre-Civil War leaders returned to power. The reforms meant to give freed slaves all the rights of citizenship are quickly rolled back. Newt Knight recognizes what these events mean for himself and his family.
He deeds 160 acres of land to his African-American wife, Rachel, which was really unprecedented in those days, because he knew that this tide was changing, and he knew that he might be killed because there were all kind of assassination attempts against him.
Because of his mixed-race family, I think Newt Knight moved out of politics. He crossed the color line. He shocked society by doing it openly. And again, in line with this personality that said, if I'm going to do it, then it's going to be all right. I'm going to do it openly.
He retreated to the hilltop farm, which is a beautiful, beautiful ridge of land with a creek behind it and this awesome view of the setting sun.
After emancipation, my grandmother and her family moved from the old slave plantation in Jones County to Jasper County. They went with one of the younger Knights who did not believe in slavery.
So reads a passage from Mississippi Girl, the 1952 autobiography of Newt's daughter, Anna Knight.
Now, Newt Knight himself was part of the creation of a public school system around 1870, and when he tried to send his mixed-race children to the local public school that was being established, He was told his children could not attend there because they were mixed race.
Unable to find a school in her area, Anna Knight travels to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where she will attend school and live with a missionary couple from the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And they just took her in and tried to get her an education, but the school where she went to, they wouldn't accept her.
Other members of the school complained that they were not going to have their children attending school with someone who was really black, you know, because this is segregation. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church itself took and privately educated her and still continued to support her.
Anna later adopts the Seventh-day Adventist faith, becomes a nurse, and upon graduation in 1898, travels to India as a medical missionary.
And she came back to this area to start her school in Gaetano, near Gaetano, and that was a school that Newt helped her build, her uncles helped her to build, so that the children, the mixed race children in the community there could go to school. She did a lot for this community. She did a lot for her people here, a lot for this community. And
not only here, she went further in Mississippi in different areas. Summerall, where there was family. She taught her sister a lot, and her sister kind of picked up when she left.
After training her sister, Grace, to teach in the local school, Anna Knight moves on, establishing schools across the South.
Newt believed in helping people, no matter who they were. If Anna wanted to get an education, he supported her in whatever she wanted to do. If she wanted to come back here and start a school for the people in the community, he supported her. He said, I support you in whatever you do because it's for the good of the people.
In February of 1922, Newt Knight dies. He is buried near Rachel, beneath a simple stone that reads, "He lived for others."
After Newt passed, they lost his protection. As long as he was the family patriarch, nobody really messed with him, with the families. But once he died, they didn't quite feel safe. They had a hard time. My grandfather's brother had a very successful store that he ran, and they had to pick up and leave all of that. They got run out of Jasper County because they, as my grandfather would say, forgot their place, and they had to leave. They started leaving Mississippi to find jobs, and they had a pretty good rudimentary education, and they were able to go off and, as whites, and get good jobs that they would not have been able to get if they had gone and said they were black.
During that time, that's just the way it was. You know, that's just the way it was. The lighter you married, the better off you would be in that society at that time. And so, you know, I don't know. It's changed, and then it has not changed. So you just, and it's not only in Mississippi, this is across the country. I've lived all over the United States just about, and it's just about the same, you know.
In 1948, Davis Knight, the great-grandson of Newt and Rachel, is arrested, tried, and convicted for marrying outside his race.
It wasn't uncommon for this area for the descendants of Newt Knight. They looked just like any other white person. But you know, there was always that 1/8 rule. And so they tended to marry white or cousins or whatever in order to try to marry this out. And I think that's a lot of what the Davis Knight trial was, to figure out whether or not he was black or white. That's what they were trying to do.
It's hard for people to understand it. It's very difficult to look like you're white and you go around saying, I'm black, but and people looking at you like, what do you mean? And as a child, when I was coming, and with my blue eyes and straight hair like I have, people would ask me, what are you? And if a white person made a mistake thinking I was white, and then they found out I wasn't, they would get upset. And I could never figure that out. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. It's not easy, unless you live in a community like where I lived, where there were a lot of people that looked like me. Well, everybody in the communities was related, black, white, green, or purple. They were all related.
Yes, everybody's related.
Yeah.
The mentality of most of the people here who know about the Knights, the white Knights, the black Knights, and the half-white Knights. There's 3 sets of Knights here. And you start talking, they'll say, the older people say, just leave it alone. They don't want you to know.
But this new millennium generation, it's a little different now. And if we can go on Facebook, if you go on the Descendants of Newt Knight on Facebook, you see all colors on there. And they always say, we all related, we are family. All related, all related.
When I was going to school at So-So Elementary, I was on the basketball team and we won the state championship. And later on, I was just going through my pictures, it was 2 years ago, and I got to reading the names under the thing, and I was like, the Knight, the Crosby, the AGs, and then I went online and I started tracking who they were, and I was like, I'm related to these. And then I got to looking a little bit further down, and we were all related. I got in contact with 3 or 4 of them, and they said, yeah, I've always known we were related. And I was like, well, why didn't you tell me we were related? So they couldn't tell me because the African American side of the Knights were not allowed to tell us for some reason. I don't know if it was just the era we lived in, and us not knowing, it made me mad, it really did. Because I felt close to them. I had this sense of family with all my classmates, and it was a family, and I didn't know it.
I have seen many students come through a system of education in history where they were transformed by it. They were changed. Many of them said, we always thought Newt Knight was a traitor and that he did awful things. They're a new generation that's looking at Newt Knight with new eyes. And that takes education, and that takes an understanding of history.
I feel a whole lot better knowing my past than not knowing. It really brings me peace, and it gives me strength because they had such a struggle. And I think knowing that what they had to go through, things that I have to deal with from day to day or in my life, I know that I can do it too.
Sometimes our family reunions are like a beautiful rainbow, all shades of color just floating in the sky. Yes, we are a part of Newt Knight's actions, but it makes me proud to be a part of this historical and controversial family, no matter where it leads. Yes, our family tree branches are very complex. It does not matter which way the branches of the tree extend, it is always reaching upward and outward, gathering in all to form one giant tree.
Newt Knight is like a Rorschach test, the psychological test where what do you see when you look at this picture? When people look at Newt Knight, whatever it is that they care most about is who Newt Knight becomes, whether they want to be inspired by him, whether they want to censure him, whether they think he's the most noble person who ever came along and a world saver, or whether they see him as the scourge of the South. Newt Knight's their man, and we would have had to invent him if he had not lived.
But who really knows the truth? You weren't there.
Mm-hmm. It's according to what you want to believe. We knew what he did for us. That's why we have most of the land in this area, is because he left it to his children, and in turn it was left to us. And so we keep on passing it down. So he took care of both sides of his family, not only us, but the other side of his family too. We just can't claim him all ourselves, but he did take care of us.